Hi everyone. In this video, we're going to talk about effective approaches to vocabulary and comprehension instruction. And as I begin to kind of open up a little bit more to you in terms of who I am as a teacher and as a person, this palm tree that you see is a glimpse of my front yard. The instruction in this video will be guided by certain evidence-based literacy practices that are supported by the National Reading Panel. You want to create a classroom culture that fosters literacy motivation. Motivation does matter. Teach reading for authentic, meaning authentic to people's lives in ways that students can find important to them. Pleasure is important too. You want students to enjoy what they're doing. Provide students with scaffolding, just-in-time instruction, tips, cues in important areas of literacy. Now, important here as we talk about phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. Remember that there's a difference between constrained and unconstrained skills. And as I've been reading your responses, I'm a little bit concerned that maybe I haven't stressed that enough. Remember that phonemic awareness and phonics are both constrained skills. What I mean by that is that once a student has mastered phonemic awareness, they're not going to continue to show literacy gains if you continue to teach that past the point of mastery. Same thing with phonics. Once students have mastered basics of phonics, they're not going to continue to show literacy gains past the point of mastery. So when a student has mastered phonemic awareness, you don't need to continue to drill them on phonemic awareness or phonological awareness. Same thing goes with phonics. Sometimes your middle school students and high school students may be struggling with phonics, but they may not be struggling in phonics. That's where assessment comes in, and that's where working with a specialist comes in, with Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 instructional modes, with response intervention. A student who is struggling in phonics does benefit from explicit direct instruction in phonics and phonics interventions. But a middle school student who is already, or even late elementary school student who has already mastered phonics doesn't benefit from continued drilling in phonics. So be careful of that a little bit. For instance, if you're teaching a middle school class or a high school class where you've got students who have mastered phonics, don't give them phonics exercises. They've already mastered it. You want to move on and focus on vocabulary and comprehension, with fluency being a bridge between phonics and vocabulary and comprehension. You want to give students plenty of time to read and write in class and provide students opportunities for high quality experiences with multiple genres and multiple modes of texts. Want to use multiple texts to expand their use of vocabulary in different ways, build whole class communities, a classroom learning environment, have opportunities for wide discussion of texts, use technology as a tool to expand their use. For instance, digital storytelling can be very engaging to students, and use a variety of assessment techniques to inform your adjustments in your curriculum. You want to focus on how vocabulary are used in context, not just simply that vocabulary means something. It's not enough for students to memorize the definition of a word. They need to know how to use it in varied contexts. And you want to help students make connections between knowing how to use a vocabulary word and using it to aid in reading comprehension of increasingly complex texts. You want to build a word-rich environment in which you've got multiple encounters with text, digital encounters, artistic, visual, reading and writing experiences, conversations. You want to have wide reading, and you want to engage in explicit vocabulary learning. And please watch the links that I provided for you, which will give you greater depth, both from different perspectives, as well as a sort of substitute for you being able to be in the classroom and see what I'm talking about in action. Anita Archer, provides. This is an hour and a half long discussion. You may find certain parts of it more interesting than others, I suppose. It's basically a professional development for teachers in Ohio, but I consider this discussion by Anita Archer to be well worth your time if you take your time for it this week. You want to focus on very specific and very exact definitions, but help students know how to use vocabulary words in different contexts. Reading aloud is a very useful way of teaching for vocabulary as well as comprehension. For instance, storybook readings and different opportunities to use the vocabulary in different genres and in different ways of encountering text, digital, print, for instance, and hold discussions with students. Book clubs, for instance, involve students in discussions both before, during, and after reading the book in order to ask questions, make predictions, verify whether their predictions were coming true or not, why or why not. Help children to encounter words in multiple ways and talk about these words in multiple ways. Engage students in rich dialogue. You want to read the book in a naturalistic way that is appropriate for the text as opposed to being overly dramatic and melodramatic as you're reading this text. Engage students with graphic organizers to help them make mental maps of the words that they're learning. There's various different ways of doing graphic organizers, and help students connect new words and new knowledge with background knowledge. Again, in multiple ways: technological, dramatic performance, plays, music. The I do it, we do it, you do it approach we've been talking about is one way of talking about the gradual release of responsibility. Think of the gradual release of responsibility as basically a type of scaffolding of instruction where you help students to gain skills in which they need help at first, but you're guiding students toward eventually using these skills and strategies of more complex texts and in more complex ways independently as they gain practice. Students at grade level or higher benefit from guiding other students, having a chance to teach other students, being involved in flexible grouping, challenging activities, inquiry-based learning. You want to develop rubrics to assess where students are at and how they are making gains in their skills. Provide potentially more time for reading practice for struggling readers, and engage in very direct, systematic, and explicit instruction of helpful strategies. Along with coaching, of course. You want to have intensive and personalized instruction, oftentimes with a tutor and oftentimes with pull-out groups. Remember, with struggling readers, we get into assessment of why a reader is struggling, and we need to oftentimes work with Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 instruction with RTI. Tier 1 being general instruction, Tier 2 being more intensive with pull-out groups, and Tier 3 being exceptional education with really much more intensive instruction as identified by individual education plans. You want to think about and drawing on a concept called universal design for learning, you want to think about what aspects of instruction might be hindering that student and try to minimize those barriers to reading and writing skill. Assessment is critical. Multiple forms of a text of assessment. You want to have your assessment task be one that matches what you want students to be learning. For instance, they can complete a definition map if you're teaching their understandings of definitions. Evaluate vocabulary in context of meaningful activities. And again, I give you examples here, such as word walls, vocabulary charts, and journaling, that are all examples of formative assessment techniques. Remember that vocabulary instruction needs to be seen as tightly linked to comprehension instruction. That's why I'm teaching both vocabulary and comprehension within this video. You want to promote comprehension in the context of very meaningful interactions with text, reading, writing, and the overall language arts. Remember, that's reading, writing, speaking, listening, viewing, visual representations, and creating visual representations, art and drama, and so on and so forth. All of this in combination will help students comprehend text and comprehend words as they encounter them in multiple ways. Provide motivating, engaging forms of instruction in multiple and engaging ways of encountering these words and these texts in ways that are personally and culturally meaningful to students. You want to provide a variety of materials as well as text, multiple modes of text, digital text, artistic, traditional print texts, schedule times for student and teacher-led discussions as well as conferences. Create an atmosphere of inquiry that encourages students to ask questions and engage in problem solving, and freedom to potentially be wrong without fear of embarrassment if they are wrong about something. I can send you good examples of instruction if you want about these processes that I'm talking about. For instance, English teacher Joseph Goldberg uses film in high school English classrooms to foster literary analysis and multiple ways of producing writing. For instance, students study complex film editing techniques to then produce video essays. One thing I would encourage you guys to do, and there's a reason why I'm wearing a Brooklyn Dodgers cap all of a sudden, is I would encourage you to involve your students in problem-based learning and as well as inquiry-based learning, in which they learn vocabulary words, comprehend text, and communicate in text in various ways: video, print, presentation, and maybe they read text in various ways: digital texts, document analysis, historical analysis, as they make meaning. For instance, what you're looking at here is a building in Sanford, Florida. And I'm thinking back, as I look at this building and I use this picture for you, back to when I was a high school English teacher in Sanford, Florida. This building is now abandoned, which is why it looks kind of scraggly for you. In this current picture, this picture was taken summer 2022. It used to look much better than this when it was better taken care of. Throughout most of its history, it was a place called Mayfair Inn, but then it became, after that was changed and it was no longer used as a hotel, it became used as basically a conference center by a Christian group, and it became known as for New Tribes Mission, a Christian missionary group. But here's what I could have students do, and I used to have students do this when I was a high school English teacher, is look up about the history of Mayfair Inn in Sanford, especially when it used to be used as a spring training hotel facility for the New York Giants. New York baseball Giants, when they used to train in Sanford, Florida. They could look up history of when the inn first started to be used, former owners, former tenants, a little bit of history of some of the famous baseball players and others who have stayed in that inn, some of the famous, pretty much all of the most famous New York Giants baseball players who used to play there before the team moved to San Francisco. When the team moved to San Francisco, Sanford no longer was the spring training site for the Giants, but so they could look up about that. And depending on just exactly how, frankly, brave you feel as a teacher, you can also get into looking up issues of social inequity and injustice and potential controversies. For instance, when the Giants used to play here, if there were any black baseball players, they were not allowed to stay here. This was whites only. place when the giants were using it. And so that would get into issues of social injustice and inequity and so on and so forth. And you can even get into, from there, one of the more infamous um, incidents of a nearby baseball stadium, um, where the Giants used to play their spring training games before the Giants moved to San Francisco, is that when Jackie Robinson, my Brooklyn Dodgers cap, when Jackie Robinson came to play spring training in Sanford, Florida, against the New York Giants, the city commission voted unanimously to not allow Jackie Robinson to play. And so Jackie Robinson briefly played in that spring training game, but then the chief of police for Sanford, a man named Roy G. Williams, came out and escorted Jackie Robinson off the field and out of the stadium, which is very much a tarnish on the legacy. If you were to watch the movie 42 about the experiences of Jackie Robinson as he integrated uh, baseball, played by, of course, legendary actor Chadwick Boseman, um, the racist, frankly, chief of police back then is a pretty accurate depiction of Roy G. Williams. I know that, frankly, because I know the history here a little bit. This, and again, this type of investigation you can imagine, might very much interest my students in Central Florida who were living there. I used to teach at a high school located within about 10 minutes drive, a little bit more than 10 minutes drive from where this former hotel is located. And actually, this building is located a little bit less than 2 miles away from my own Sanford home. One thing you can also do is you can have students look up about histories of historic places and how certain historic places have impacted people in the region, and get into, again, reading, writing in multiple ways that can improve engagement, motivation, um, as well as comprehension when students are feeling engaged, motivated, and it's personally, culturally meaningful to them. What you're looking at here on the screen is Busch Stadium in St. Louis, Missouri. St. Louis, as most of you probably know, has a rich cultural tradition tied with baseball. The St. Louis region has a love affair going with the Cardinals baseball team. Now, what I would have students do when I was teaching college at Harris-Stowe State University, and now granted this was college, but I'm thinking that, especially if you're teaching high school, this could be applicable for high school. When it comes to middle school, you can still do problem-based learning of difficult topics, but just be wise about it. Consult with the principal and make sure that it's age appropriate when you're talking about middle school. But what I would have students do is I would have them look up about the history of the downtown region, various peoples that have lived in the downtown region, the history behind for instance, cultural groups and where cultural groups live. And now we get into some problematic aspects. When Busch Stadium, the grounds for Busch Stadium were being prepared in the late 1960s, the grounds chosen had previously been a sort of mini unofficial Chinatown in the region. There were many businesses, many populations, the Chinese community and overall Asian community, but especially Chinese community of the region were thriving there. But they were not exactly high income group and not necessarily all that popular in St. Louis. And so the Chinese community was pretty much kicked out of that particular region and needed to find other places to go. And so this would get you into discussions about the history of how lower income people in socioeconomic status are sometimes affected this way. And there's especially a history when it comes to racial and ethnic minority groups when it comes to this type of impact. And this would also get you into potentially the way that this sort of thing can impact one minority group vis-a-vis other minority groups because, for instance, in the St. Louis region, there are issues going on in the aftermath of that displacement between Asian communities wanting to settle in certain regions and other minority groups, including historically Black communities, saying particular regions. For instance, in an area not all that far from uh, from Washington University, St. Louis, you can find some wonderful, authentic Chinese restaurants and Asian restaurants, not limited to Chinese. And when I say Chinese restaurants, I'm not talking about Americanized takeout. I'm talking about the real thing. There's a major difference, as well as Vietnamese and Korean. And again, I'm talking about the real thing here. But that type of region, and it's a region where Asian people often will like to think of as this is ours, thinking of Asian people. But it was historically, before the Asians started to come there, historically thought of as a historically Black region of the community. And so there's sort of this rubbing up against two communities rubbing up against each other that takes place and largely spurred on by the displacement of Asian communities for this baseball stadium. So you can see where this would get you into all kinds of interesting topics that can include reading and writing activities for your students. As an example of how to do this in an article, I can send you if you request it. I'm not going to have you read every one of these articles, but an English teacher named Yu Kyung-sung taught a unit about European Holocaust as well as the experiences of Japanese who were placed into internment camps during World War II. High school English teachers read text sets that focused on the experience of Japanese Americans during World War II, and she would then relate that forward to modern day experiences of Asian with anti-Asian hate crimes that took place in the wake of COVID-19. So students would read historical fiction. They would also read current day events. They would read picture book autobiographies. They would create visual imagery as well as do writing activities. You can also have students do a thematic analysis. For instance, Alice Dominguez guided her 11th grade English class through the conduct of ethnographic research, basic ethnographic research, in combination with the study of fiction as well as nonfiction texts centered around a unit about a raisin in the sun. Students engaged in a study of the play in comparison with other nonfiction texts, especially in relation to segregation. And what all this gets into is the culturally relevant instruction builds toward vocabulary as well as reading comprehension. So you want to make activities culturally responsive and relevant to the lives of students. And as we close, our last topic will be strategy instruction. You want to carefully and explicitly teach students how to use comprehension in strategies as well as word attack strategies. So remember, when we're talking about scaffolding, think of it kind of like climbing a ladder with assistance, such as wearing gloves or support systems, metaphorically. Scaffolding will include just-in-time tips. It will include hints, guides about how to do something, conferences. So you want to guide students through the use of word attack strategies as well as comprehension strategies. Talk with them about their process of understanding the text. Help them strategically make connections between reading activities that they're doing and writing activities that they're doing, for example. Teach students to actively interact with various genres of texts and learn various strategies that are appropriate for fiction as well as nonfiction texts. We'll study about various strategies for fiction and nonfiction texts next week. Teach students to independently reflect on information in a text both before, during, and after they read, and teach students to determine their purpose for reading and read very strategically. Teach students to process information as they read. That's self-regulation. And to understand how they're processing and how to make corrections as needed. Teach students to remember information, to make connections, anticipate author's purpose, and read while looking for main idea. Teach students about how to make inferences, how to make logical reasoning deductions, and how to decode words without losing their train of thought about what they're reading. Teach students to assign accurate meaning to vocabulary words as they come across this text based upon, does this make sense in context? Teach students to relate facts, imagery, concepts, connotations, figures of language, figures of speech as they're reading. Teach students how to facilitate their own small groups, which gets into a technique as we close out called reciprocal teaching. This is where first a teacher would model how to participate in groups, and a teacher would guide group discussions before setting students in to participate in group discussions of text. So typically in groups of 4, students would take on various individual roles. One student might be a questioner, one student would be a clarifier looking to clarify aspects in the text, one student would be a summarizer, summarizing what they read, and another would focus on making predictions. Students in groups would read and then guide group discussions as they then teach about the text to the rest of the class. So in order to do this, of course, when students are first getting used to doing this, the teacher would want to model the roles, each of these 4 roles, questioner, clarifier, summarizer, and predictor, for the whole class. And then some volunteers, student volunteers, would get up and also demonstrate how to be a questioner, how to be a clarifier, how to be a summarizer, as well as how to be a predictor. And then once that understanding is clear, you would assign groups and assign individual roles to individual students. Obviously, you might have to do this more than once, and it might take time for students to learn how to do this. You want to guide the students through the steps of participating in reciprocal teaching. You might want to use a bell or similar audible cue to cycle learners through the group work steps, where one time they're working on being a questioner, another time they're looking at being a clarifier. They take a certain amount of time for each of these steps. And here you see some videos of reciprocal teaching in action. Please take the time to look at these. Hopefully you enjoyed this. I tried to make this a relatively short video for you. Take care.